March 3rd, 2016. A title company office on East 42nd Street in Manhattan. A courier drops off a manila folder holding the deed to a 5-story townhouse on West 76th Street. The signature on it belongs to a man who has been dead for 11 years. The title officer who opens the folder does not know that yet. She logs the transfer, checks the notary stamp, and moves it into the closing queue. The seller is listed as Raymond Voss, owner of record since 1994. The buyer is a shell company registered in Delaware 3 weeks earlier. The sale price is $50 million, cash. Nothing about the paperwork looks wrong. That is the point. By April, the deal closes. The wire transfer clears in 9 minutes. The shell company takes title to a townhouse that Raymond Voss has not lived in since his death in 2005. His actual estate, held by a niece in New Jersey, has no idea the property changed hands. She finds out 3 months later when a property tax bill arrives addressed to a company she has never heard of. She calls the city. The clerk tells her the deed is valid, filed and recorded, signed and notarized. She calls a lawyer. The lawyer tells her this happens more than people think. What nobody in that office knew yet was that the same notary stamp had appeared on 4 other deeds that year, each one selling a property whose true owner was dead, incapacitated, or living overseas. Investigators later traced the scheme to a small title office in Queens run by a man named Anton Kessler. Kessler had worked in real estate closings for 19 years, first as a clerk, then as a licensed notary public with his own small practice near Jackson Heights. Colleagues described him as meticulous, punctual, and unremarkable, the kind of man who remembered everyone's coffee order but rarely spoke about himself. Behind that ordinary front, Kessler had built a quiet system. He would pull public death records from the city archive, cross-reference them against property tax rolls, and search for a specific profile, an owner who had died without close heirs checking city records, holding a property worth enough to justify the risk. He preferred townhouses and small commercial buildings, properties valuable enough to matter, but obscure enough that nobody watched them closely. Once he found a match, he forged a deed transfer using a notary stamp he had purchased used from a retiring colleague years earlier, a stamp that had never been reported lost or stolen because technically it had not. He filed the forged deed with the city clerk's office, where staff checked for form, not fact. Correct margins, correct signatures, correct notarization language. A deed with the right stamps and the right formatting moved through the system in days, sometimes hours. Once recorded, the property looked clean on paper. Kessler would then arrange a sale, often to a straw buyer he controlled through a shell company, sometimes to a legitimate investor who had no idea anything was wrong. The money moved fast, routed through a chain of Delaware and Nevada entities before landing in accounts overseas. By the time anyone questioned the sale, the cash had already crossed borders, and the property had often changed hands a second or third time. The West 76th Street townhouse was his biggest score, but it was not his first. Investigators would later identify a smaller property in Sunnyside, Queens, sold in 2013 using the same method: a deceased owner, a forged deed, a shell buyer, a fast resale. That case had gone unnoticed for 3 years, filed away as an ordinary probate dispute. Nobody connected it to West 76th Street until the pattern repeated itself in plain sight. Voss had no living spouse, no children, and a niece who lived 3 states away and rarely visited. The house had sat empty for over a decade, its windows dark, its mail piling in a locked box. It was, in Kessler's own words to an associate later caught on a wiretap, a house that nobody was watching. He was wrong. A neighbor on the block, a retired architect named Louis Farah, had watched that house for years, out of habit more than suspicion. He noticed contractors arriving in June 2016 to gut the interior. He asked one of them who owned the property now. The contractor did not know. Farah wrote down the name on the permit and called the city. The permit listed the Delaware Shell Company. Farah searched the company online and found nothing. No website, no employees, no filings before March of that year. He called the Department of Buildings. He called the city clerk. He called a reporter he knew at a local paper, someone who had covered zoning disputes on the Upper West Side. Within 2 weeks, the story was in print, and within a month, the district attorney's office had opened a file. What investigators found stunned them. Kessler had forged at least 6 deeds over 3 years, moving an estimated $80 million in property across Manhattan, Queens, and 1 property in the Bronx. He had a consistent method: track obituaries, file forged paperwork within weeks of a death, sell fast before anyone checked the chain of title. Because city records rarely cross-reference death certificates against deed filings, his forgeries sailed through undetected for years. The investigation took 18 months. Prosecutors built a case using bank records, wire transfer logs, and the notary stamp itself, which forensic examiners matched to microscopic ink patterns and pressure marks across all 6 forged deeds, each one filed months apart but bearing the same physical signature of a single stamp wearing down over time. One examiner testified that the stamp's slight rightward drift, worse in later filings, was as identifying as a fingerprint. Kessler was arrested in September 2018 at a diner in Astoria, where he had gone, investigators believe, to meet a buyer for a 7th property, a commercial building in the Bronx, whose owner had died 8 months earlier. He pleaded not guilty. His lawyer argued the paperwork trail was circumstantial, that anyone could have used a stolen stamp, that Kessler himself had simply processed documents handed to him by others. The trial lasted 11 weeks. Prosecutors called Farah as a witness, along with the title officer who first processed the West 76th Street deed, and 2 forensic document examiners who walked the jury through the ink chemistry linking 6 separate filings. They called a records clerk who testified that Kessler had personally filed 4 of the 6 deeds in person, using his own city identification to enter the recording office after hours. The jury convicted Kessler on all counts in March 2020, 4 years to the month after the West 76th Street deed first crossed a title officer's desk. He was sentenced to 12 years. At sentencing, the judge noted that the true scope of the fraud might never be known, because Kessler likely forged deeds the city had not yet flagged, properties still sitting under fraudulent ownership with nobody aware. That warning proved accurate. In the years since the conviction, 3 more properties have surfaced with the same suspicious pattern: a deceased owner, a shell company buyer, a sale that closed within weeks of the death being recorded. One was a row house in Bedford and Stuyvesant, discovered in 2022 when a distant cousin tried to claim an inheritance and found the deed already transferred. None of the 3 has been definitively linked to Kessler. Investigators believe he trained at least one associate in the scheme before his arrest, someone who has never been identified and who may still be operating. The West 76th Street townhouse itself sat in legal limbo for nearly 5 years. Because the deed transfer was fraudulent, the sale to the Delaware Shell Company was voided, but the Shell Company had already resold the property twice more, each buyer claiming to have purchased in good faith, each with documentation that appeared legitimate on its face. Untangling the chain of title took a team of city lawyers, 3 separate court rulings, and a settlement that left 2 of the later buyers only partially compensated for their losses. The house finally returned to the Voss estate in 2021, 15 years after Raymond Voss's death and 5 years after the fraud was discovered. His niece sold it that same year at a fraction of what it might have brought had the original scheme never touched it, its market value depressed by years of legal uncertainty and deferred maintenance. She used part of the proceeds to fund a small nonprofit that helps families track deed changes on inherited property, a service that did not exist when she needed it most. City officials, facing pressure after the case became public, promised reforms.
A task force was formed to cross-reference death certificates against property records within 30 days of a filing, a system meant to catch the next Kessler before a forged deed could clear. 3 years later, the task force had reviewed less than a tenth of the backlog it was created to address. Understaffed and underfunded, it processes new deaths, but has never gone back to check the decade of filings that came before it, filings that predate the reform entirely. Farah, the neighbor whose curiosity broke the case open, still lives on West 76th Street. He says he checks the ownership records on every empty house within 4 blocks of his own, a habit he started the week he called the Department of Buildings about the contractors next door. He has flagged 2 more suspicious filings since then, both still under investigation, both bearing the same quiet pattern of a distant heir and a fast, unquestioned sale. Kessler, now serving his sentence upstate, has never revealed how many deeds he actually forged. Prosecutors believe the real number is closer to 15 than 6, based on notary logs recovered from his old office that show gaps and irregularities they were never able to fully explain. Those logs remain sealed as part of an ongoing inquiry into properties across 3 boroughs, an inquiry with no announced end date. What the case exposed was not one man's scheme, but a gap in the system itself. A city that records who owns a house, but rarely checks whether the owner is even alive. Death certificates and deed filings live in separate databases, built decades apart, never designed to talk to each other. For 19 years, that gap was Anton Kessler's entire business model, and for at least one unidentified associate, it may still be. Today, the empty houses of the dead still sit across the city, waiting for someone to notice. Farah checks the ones near him. Nobody checks the rest.